Okay, I'm going to put Don's version over here. Don's modification. Don's modified version. Okay? If voluntarism is true, then God's commands are arbitrary. Okay? But nothing about God is arbitrary, so voluntarism is false. Okay? I reject premise one, so my premise one goes like this. If voluntarism is true, then God's love is arbitrary. But nothing about God is arbitrary, so voluntarism is false. Is that clear? Yeah.
Like just a question, is that arbitrary?
No, that's just outline form.
Oh,
Roman numeral 1, capital A, objection 1. I'm just trying to show the way it all sort of lines up. So the best exam has the most detail and explains it really well. Less detail, less good. No exam gets all the details perfectly. It's not so important to me. You know, my objection to Arthur isn't so important to me because the substance of his argument is still available. I never thought it was that powerful an argument because I don't see why some aspects of God couldn't be arbitrary. I just don't agree with that.
Right.
The second premise.
How would you understand how people like you
Hang on, let me just finish answering Rose's question, okay? So, likewise, I don't think that distinguishing the two premises of the first argument and objecting to one premise and then showing which objections go to the first premise and which ones go to the second premise is as important as getting the objections, being thorough with the objections. It would be really nice, it would be very impressive if a student could say, these are objections to the first premise of argument 1 against voluntarism, and these are objections to the second premise. But that's not really so important. What's important is the objections. Likewise here, my response, this is filigree. This is a little bit of really nice detail. But if you got this part, you can do it pretty darn well. So do I want you to? Yeah. Is it essential for making an A? No.
It's just as long as we explain the objections that if we include something like that, to kind of explicate it further.
It's just, I'm kind of adding up points you're making. And when you make these really fine-grained points, that's very impressive. And so it gives you, add some credit. If you make so putting aside the bullshit factor and putting aside how good your explanations are, you're just looking for how many good points there are. But no exam gets them all. And so a really good exam could, will certainly get several of the points that I've made. There are other factors, like how well you're explaining. Would it be better to have more detail? Sure, but if more detail gets, mess things up, if the detail turns out to mess things up or show you didn't understand the other stuff, you'd have been better off without it. So it's kind of hard to say because it's a bit of a gestalt. The exam question I gave you last time, the advantage of it is that it's kind of objective. I just sort of count points literally, add them up. But the problem is, that makes it really hard because a lot of people get very few of them. So I do some of these. And everybody is very good now. Okay, now what was the next question?
If most people who
How would they? They have to either reject that voluntarism implies arbitrariness, or they have to say that God is arbitrary in at least that one respect. Some people will say all sorts of stuff about it, but you want to defend it rationally, and that's what I'd say. Some people would say, it doesn't have to make sense because it's about God, and then I'd say you do,
I just want to understand how voluntarism flows into being arbitrary. So is it the idea that if you're volunteers, then you'll follow God no matter what, so it doesn't really matter?
It's not about why you do it. It's about why God picks one rule over another.
Okay.
There's no reason to pick one over another because Love your neighbor is no better than hate your neighbor. And God picks. God doesn't have a reason for picking them.
And it's the assumption that it's just gonna be right.
It will be right because voluntarism says that whatever God tells us to do is what we ought to do, because God tells us. God gets to make it up from scratch. And so there isn't any getting it right on God's part. God gets it right automatically. Even if God picks Nazism, that's right.
And that conflicts with any notion of evidence morality.
And the problem isn't that, because the voluntarist is willing to reject that there's a morality that's fixed apart from God. They think God gets to fix morality. It conflicts with the idea that God does stuff for a reason.
Okay.
The first question, the first objection is one about torturing babies. Just the idea is that voluntarism is going to conflict with certain moral intuitions that people think take very, very seriously. If voluntarism is true, we may have to accept all sorts of weird possibilities.
Can we go for that first one?
Yes, but was that what you were doing? Somebody move us to there? Let's look at the first one. Okay, so here's the first objection to voluntarism. It's that if voluntarism is true, it's another reductio, okay, so it's a modus tollens. If voluntarism is true, then C. Well, what is C? I made C equivalent to something like this. It could be our moral duty to torture infants for fun. But as Rachel pointed out once in class, C could have been any number of other, weird possibilities. So if voluntarism is true, then it could be that we have a duty to, masturbate in public. Or if voluntarism is true, then it could be that we have a duty to kill every third child. Or if voluntarism is true, it could be that it's our duty to, you name it.
Did you get that from those who've
What?
the guy who was
Masturbating
masturbating in
in
public
public.
over on Redstone?
Did I put that over in Roscoe?
No. There was some
They
email
said that actually
from
happened.
some guy on like, what was it, like Wednesday?
It's 500 South Prospect Street.
Was
Like on Thursday
Yeah.
at like 11. It was
That
like
people should be masturbating in public?
No,
he did,
caught a guy
like,
doing that.
he was
Oh,
masturbating.
maybe I saw that, and that's
Exactly
what
what it said.
got it in my mind. Maybe I saw that. It was like a police dispatch or something?
Yeah. Police service.
Yeah, probably. I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but it could be that having seen that police dispatch, I thought of that as an absurd duty.
They want to come?
One other what?
There was one incident like that at Converse, like.
Public
it was good.
incidents.
You just like it, and
I would say whatever turns you on, but I don't think that's true in this circumstance.
Just
it's not morally right.
I don't think it's okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry for partying, bro.
So this one's just that if you disagree with any part, you have to fill the whole thing out.
If you disagree with C and all the things like it, then you've got to reject voluntarism. So I haven't finished the argument. If voluntarism is true, premise 1, if voluntarism is true, then C. Premise 2, that C isn't true. So conclusion, voluntarism isn't true.
And C can mean like anything.
C could be anything of this sort.
Yeah.
It could be our moral duty to, or it could be morally acceptable to.
So any worst case scenario.
Anything weird, any weird moral claim.
Okay.
It could be that Nazism is morally required. It could be that, we should all kill people whose last names start with Z. It could be that, we should keep making babies until we make the next Martin Luther King,
So, the objection to premise 2.
So there were
Just have to
several
flat out
objections.
say, like,
There were several objections. The objection to premise 2, this is the one that says it couldn't be okay to torture infant children. And there were several objections to each of these. The main objection to the second one was that I'm begging the question by saying that C couldn't be true, right? But according to voluntarism, C could be true. So the voluntarist says, yeah, if voluntarism is true, then it could be our moral duty to torture infants for fun. You're right. Well, what's the problem with that? You seem to be denying that, Don. That's question begging here. And I say, well, you've got to pick your probabilities here. I mean, plausibilities here. That's the way argument works. If voluntarism is true, then C is correct. but C isn't correct, so voluntarism isn't true. Or you could say voluntarism is true, then C is correct, and C is correct, so I don't see any objection to voluntarism. You know, or voluntarism is true, and C is correct, so but voluntarism is true, so C is correct. The voluntarist just turns it on its head. It says, since I accept voluntarism, I'm willing to accept all those claims that you think are absurd, that you label C. I'm willing to say that if voluntarism is true, then it could be our duty to be Nazis. And it could be our duty to be Nazis. When would it be our duty? If God told us to. So you're begging the question, Don, by assuming that it couldn't be okay to do those things when it could be okay to do those things because that's what voluntarism says. And I say, okay, but you've got a choice now. You can accept voluntarism, and then you've got to accept all those weird moral claims, or you can reject voluntarism, in which case you can reject all those weird moral claims. I know which package seems more plausible to me. And then I started throwing in some other benefits and costs of the view, if you remember. Like a benefit to my side is that you can say of God that God is good and be saying something interesting about God. There's a standard of goodness that God conforms to. Something on the other side is that if voluntarism isn't true, then God isn't as powerful as we might have thought. That's an objection. That's a cost, you might think, to accepting voluntarism. And there were lots of other objections to this argument, if you remember. I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah.
So I just kind of at the end, after the objection to two, said this like side note disadvantages of voluntarism. Is that okay? Like I just put there, I put two and then I put a response to one of them.
Yeah, I mean, the cost and benefit point is true no matter which. Once you're done with all three of them, you can say, still, we haven't finished the argument because we've got all these objections and replies to them, but there are other costs to accepting voluntarism or other benefits to accepting voluntarism, and let's look at those too. In the end, you have to just add it all up. So if you accept voluntarism, then you have to accept that it could be okay to torture infant children for fun. It could be our duty to. You have to accept that something about God is arbitrary. You have to accept that morality isn't as big a deal as we thought it was. You have to accept that you can't call God good and be saying something interesting by that. But you get to accept that God is all-powerful. Add it up. To me, it looks like it's a pretty easy case, actually.
So the first one was about one of the objections that you brought up was that God couldn't
Right, there was a little series of those, okay? So the first objection is this premise. This says, if voluntarism is true, then it could be our duty to torture children for fun, right? Some people say, no, it couldn't, because God couldn't command that because that would be wrong, and God's good. And to that I said, hold on. You're assuming a standard of morality apart from God, which is exactly what voluntarism denies. So I make this argument, right? This is a standard argument against voluntarism. It's got two premises. The first one is, if voluntarism is true, then something absurd would be true. Some moral absurdity would be correct, right? And what the voluntarist says at this point, or what they might try to say, is, no, God couldn't make it our duty to torture infants for fun, because that would be wrong, and God wouldn't tell us to do something wrong.